Welcome. You're listening to the Good Girls Don't podcast with Ashley Ray
and Verity Mansfield.
This is the podcast where we smash those rules that we've been taught to follow both as men and women and burn the damn rule book. We're tackling the big issues and the issues nobody wants to talk about, and we'll be fiercely feminist about it.
This podcast is about inspiration, education, compassion, and being the change that you need to see in this world. This podcast is for the trailblazers, the freedom fighters, and the soul igniters, and all the women just like you who are ready to break the good girl rules and be heard.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and its First Nations people on which this podcast is produced and consumed. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Get ready for the revolution. It's coming to you now. It's coming to you now. We're gonna sing an evolution. And they'll never bring us down. No, they'll never bring us down.
Hey Verity, how you going?
Hey Ashley, my love. Well, I am so excited because I feel like this is a really powerful and passionate episode, and our listeners are really going to not just love, but to really learn and understand so much more around domestic violence, and especially why women stay in domestic violent relationships.
It's such a big conversation, and genuinely, I think this is also one of the first conversations where, number one, I could say more than one sentence. Two, where I think your jaw hit the floor more than mine.
Which allowed you to get in more than one or two sentences.
It's amazing. It was really incredible. But tell us more, Verity. What did we chat about?
Oh, we talked so much. Anita has so much yummy goodness. We talked about the feminine principle hemispherectomy, which I can only just pronounce, but it's absolutely mind-blowing. And I think it's like the perfect underlying principle behind feminism, but also why it is so important to talk about in relation to domestic violence. We also talked about why women don't want to identify with being in domestic violent relationships.
Really,
and
who
why,
would?
Yeah, and when we do talk about domestic violence, why people don't respond to those posts even on social media. We also talked about why women and men stay in domestic violent relationships. And I think it's important to reiterate that it's not just women who, are at the receiving end of domestic violence, but men do too.
And our non-binary friends.
Yes, exactly. And also we discussed how domestic violence and why it's still increasing regardless of the amount of awareness campaigns that have gone on and have increased over the last decade.
Hashtag really Australia says no.
It certainly does. We also talked about, I find this really ironic, considering we're talking about domestic violence, but why anger is an expression of self-love. So you have to tune in to really understand this, because I think it's so important, and it really is at the crux of the whole conversation. And we also talked about why embracing the feminine within ourselves, whether we're male or female, is the solution to the prevention of domestic violence.
Oh, it's such a delicious conversation. And look, Anita's not just anyone who's done any kind of counselling certificate or diploma. She's taken a really deep dive into this. So let's just give you a little bit of a framework of who she is and why we brought her onto the podcast. And you'll understand even more so why this was such a big and necessary conversation for us to have here.
And why she's the perfect person to talk to.
Oh, exactly. Anita's a psychotherapist. She's been working in the field for 25 years, specialising in trauma and abuse, especially around domestic violence. She published her book, The Wolf in a Suit, in 2016, and she went on a journey to discover what was missing for women to feel safe and happy in the world. She realised that awareness was only creating more overwhelm and outrage. And so she began developing her own theories about love and solutions, so we don't have to wait for powers in the public to become active, for women to be active and powerful in their own lives.
It's so beautiful.
Oh my gosh, yes. Anita continues to write books, speak at events, run workshops and women's groups, has a few self-paced online courses, regular webinars, and a 5-week small group program to teach women about the love, stress, skills our parents didn't know how to teach us. And personally, I met Anita about 18 months ago when I was working on another podcast called Recovery, which is no longer available for a few different reasons. She just blew my mind with the work that she does. And I think I just felt like this woman just radiates a kind of love that we don't see enough in this world.
Yeah, she's absolutely fascinating to talk to, and she is definitely one of those women who walks her talk. And also she knows the knowledge from both the intellectual side and understanding the brain as well, and how the brain works, I guess, in supporting domestic violence. But also, you know, at a really personal level through her own experiences and her personal life with domestic violence. And so she really brings to the table so much experience and wisdom and knowledge around this topic. So definitely keep on listening, because you're going to absolutely love this conversation.
Welcome to the Good Girls Don't podcast, Anita Bentata.
Thank you, Ashley. It's gorgeous to be here.
It's wonderful to have you.
We're so excited about this podcast because it really is such a massive, massive issue that's so close to our hearts. I think all three of us.
Yes.
So we're so grateful to have you on.
Oh, thank you, Verity. It's just great to be talking to you both.
So can you tell us how you started working with issues around domestic violence?
Sure. I escaped from domestic violence with my 2 young girls in the 90s. And I went into therapy to make sure that never happened to me again. And after a couple of years of therapy, I thought, I think I would like to work in this field, because I've been working in accounts and bookkeeping, and I'd really enjoyed my career. But I knew after I had my children, I wanted to do something more people-oriented. It'd been very safe for me to just work with numbers and be more solitary. And having children really opened me up to letting more of myself out. And then after therapy, it was like, okay, this is what I want to do. So I changed careers and became a psychotherapist, did my basic uni degree. But then when I was working in the field, I went back and I did further specialist training on trauma and abuse, because so many clients have that in their background, and basic qualifications just don't allow you to work in depth and correctly with someone that has some kind of trauma.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all had an experience of maybe not having the correctly qualified person for our needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that I'm really passionate about is that the basic qualification, even for a psychologist and for counselling qualifications, do not adequately, they're just superficial. And even if it's a module for a semester, that's not enough to know how to work with trauma, how it affects the brain, the body, the unconscious.
Yeah.
And so many times when I talk to women, they say, oh yeah, my therapist says she works with trauma and abuse. And I ask them to tell me what this therapist does with them. And then I say, I'm sorry, I don't believe that your therapist knows how to work with trauma and abuse. You're actually getting re-traumatized. And people often, because they've been in difficult situations, they expect the therapy to be difficult, and they don't realise that it can actually feel a lot better than it does. So I'm really passionate. You know, the qualification I did took me 4 years, and what a requirement was that I went into deep therapy myself to work with your own trauma, so that you know your own territory and you don't collude with clients and just talk about things instead of actually working into things. So,
I love this so much, Anita.
It's so important. And, you know, I'll totally back you up, because I did a degree in psychology and I found it very, very, it was like a generic breakfast food. And I was seeing people going off afterwards who were finishing before me and working in areas of like addiction or abuse. And the stuff that they were saying to clients just appalled me, because I was like, oh my goodness, what? And they would just say, well, why can't you just go get a hobby? So they were coming out with a psychology degree and telling addicts, well, maybe if they just got a hobby, they could stop being addicts. And it really sort of showed to me that a basic psychology degree just wasn't enough. And it's only when I went on to do counselling that I was forced then to actually have to do units in like self-awareness and actually have therapy myself. And I think there was more learning in that than in any textbook I possibly could have picked up. So I love it. I really love the fact that you've raised that conversation. And I think if you're going to be in a place where you're going to help other people to do the work, you need to have done the work first yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And you've got to know it stuff beyond the conscious brain. You've got to know the involuntary things that happen in the brain and the body, and how to work with the unconscious beliefs that naturally get activated when we're in a survival mode, when we're under threat, physical or non-physical threat. It sets up limiting beliefs and limiting behaviours. And if you just try and talk on a conscious level, our conscious self will want all of those things. All of those things will make good sense. But it doesn't mean in the heat of an emotion that we can live from that, because feelings mobilise our behaviours. And if we're under a feeling that's got anxiety, fear, we're going to involuntarily be caught into more limited survival coping mechanisms. And so we really need practitioners to be working far more in depth to engage with the whole of a person, not just the part of their conscious brain that wants to address whatever it is that's going on.
Oh, that is so true. I absolutely love it. So you published a book called The Wolf in a Suit. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. When I was first running domestic violence groups in the late 90s, the women asked me to write a book to explain to community why women stay, because that was really important for them, and I promised them I would. And then I forgot all about it in my process of getting myself and my children on our feet and moving on. But then when I turned 50, I remembered that promise, and I thought, if I don't do it now, it'll never happen. So I wrote this book for them. But it was also a really healing process for me, even though I'd done a lot of healing already, because I still held some resentment towards my family and community for their lack of appropriate action and lack of heartfelt action.
Yeah.
And so part one in the book is my story, to explain what I went through with my children and I, and how I understand my early life impacting and shaping me, and what recovery was like for me, and going through court and things. And then part two, which is like 2/3 of the book, I'm then speaking as a psychotherapist, and I tell 11 fairy tales that I created, I reinterpreted myself, and I use those fairy tales to bring in the science and psychology that's not part of the common knowledge still, and not even in all professionals' knowledge. So that's my book, The Wolf in a Suit.
Wow. And where can people get a hold of this book? It sounds absolutely like a fascinating read, and I think it's a topic like this comes up so much of, why do women stay in these relationships? Like I've heard it so often as a little girl. When I found out about my mum's situation, I couldn't understand why she would have stayed. And then as I got older and I had friends involved in domestic violence, and if I, went to work and was like, oh my goodness, this just happened for a friend of mine, the first question out of anyone's mouth would be, well, why is she with him? And there always seemed like this bit of a blame as well on the female. But no one seems to really, like if you've not been in a situation, no one seems to really understand why women or even men stay in domestic violence relationships.
Yeah, exactly. So, I go into a lot of depth to explain my theories, and a lot of my theories come out of my knowledge as a trauma psychotherapist, but also from my lived experience. So I can give examples, and then I can explain why because I've lived inside it as well. And so I didn't know I was living with domestic violence. I knew it wasn't good, but I didn't realise this was domestic violence. And I think, we're such a mirror of our community about what physical and sexual abuse is seen as criminal, but not all the non-physical and psychological, even though they use that psychological torture through war and, in a whole lot of ways, and it's seen as a war offence, but it's not seen as an offence when it's war in the home.
War in the home. And I think that's the other thing as well, isn't it? It's still like educating the general public that emotional abuse, psychological abuse, like even like with gaslighting and that manipulative behaviour, and financial abuse comes under domestic violence, but because it's not a physical aggressive, it doesn't leave bruises or broken bones, and no one bleeds from it, we don't seem to, like you say, even acknowledge that stuff happens in our relationships.
And I think there's a number of factors of that. But one of the things that I write about in my book is that when we are feeling emotionally harmed by someone that's significant to us in our life, the same areas of the brain light up as if we're being physically harmed. And so, if we listened to the way the body responds to abuse, physical or non-physical, and we took that as the barometer of what is toxic, then we would have a very different understanding than what society recognises. But I think one of the reasons why in Australia we have such a significant issue with domestic violence is because we have a lot of unrecognised and unresolved trauma, from the Indigenous inhabitants of this country through to everybody that came here because they had to leave their other country as a refugee or asylum, or because of a convict history. There's such a history of generational trauma, and people don't recognise when there's generational trauma in their own family system. And so, if just the same as like what you were talking about, Verity, about with your family, in my family there's been a lot of trauma and abuse on a whole range of different levels. And so we don't realise that our unconscious goes into what we can pay attention to and what we can't pay attention to, and what we learn to minimise, or we actually become amnesic to when we don't see or hear certain things because our system has learnt, and it's often passed down about what we pay attention to and what we don't. And because as children our brain it doesn't finish developing till we're in our 20s, and we're emotionally, physically dependent on our parents for survival, there's this non-verbal threat for life, death, terror to, I've got to do what my environment needs from me to stay alive.
Yes.
So we learn to not see things, and we learn, like whether our family's religious or not, we're living in a culture that's got a Judaic-Christian influence of thou shalt honour thy mother and thy father. And so we grow up with not wanting to name what's happening in our own family, excusing and minimising, and so we take these habits into our adult relationships, and we can get caught into worse situations or the same kind of situations because we've just got this default map of minimising, not seeing, avoiding what feels uncomfortable.
Yes, we do. And I I heard this on ABC Q&A, the Broadside episode that got pulled from ABC iView recently with Nayuka Gori. And she said, we have to understand that there is imported trauma in this country. Like,
yes,
talking about colonization, understanding that the people who came here were deeply traumatized, ripped from their families, with all the dysfunction that has happened for generations in the United Kingdom and Europe. And it was all brought here and then put onto the Indigenous population and all of the horrific things that we did to them as well. And it's, I hadn't actually given that bit, that idea of where this intergenerational trauma and where that comes from much thought until I actually heard that and went, oh my God, that makes sense. We're so messed up.
Yeah, and I'd love to share a couple of stories with you about intergenerational trauma still having an influence even when our conscious mind thinks it's nothing to do with us, because our conscious mind knows we're not in the situation of our grandparents or our parents or whatever. Because one of the things that I'm really passionate about in my work is about one of the reasons why we're not moving ahead in domestic violence is because we're not connected to our unconscious. Because every single woman that I asked, did you have early warning signs, always says yes. And same, I had early warning signs too. But there's so much of, if we engage with our unconscious, and our unconscious is always communicating to our conscious, then we can get so much more information about what's going on. But we live in a culture that devalues the feminine principles.
Yeah.
Feelings, the body, the unconscious, a lot of the right brain qualities, and we overvalue the left brain, the rational, the black and white, the detail, the practical, the mathematical, the proof kind of thing. But when we have those left brain qualities without the connection to the right brain intelligence, we make inaccurate conclusions and assessments. And so, you know, it's so important that we understand about the power of the unconscious, and we know how to harness that for ourselves, and we can become so much more powerful in our life when we do that. So if I can I share a couple of quick examples?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, please do.
When I come from a Jewish background, and so my parents on my mum's side was born in Poland in World War II, and so there was a lot of persecution and life-death terror for her growing up. Now, and I grew up Jewish with both my parents being Jewish. When I was a kid, I was in the scouting movement, and I was in the Ventura program, which is for teenagers, and I was in a Jewish Ventura program, which was great fun. I enjoyed it. But as an adult, I was invited to come back to the centre where we used to meet, the Scout Hall, and have a reunion. And so I thought, oh, yeah, that'll be fun to see everybody again. It's been years. When I was walking, I parked my car and I walked down that street, and I looked up at the Scout Hall that I used to go to every week as a kid. I involuntarily had this fear rush through, and this thought that, oh my God, everybody's going to know I'm Jewish because it had a Jewish sign. It was a Jewish Scout Centre. And it's like, well, why am I scared of that happening in this day and age? Why is that an issue? It shouldn't have been a fear of mine to walk into a Scout Hall for a reunion that I was going to. So that to me was like one little example of that unconscious generational fear of being Jewish and therefore getting persecuted. But a few years ago, I had the blessing to be able to go to Spain, and my father's side of the family originate from Spain and being Jewish, but were kicked out of Spain because of being Jewish through the Spanish Inquisition. And that's been researched in our family history. And I was touring with a friend going all around Spain, absolutely loving everything about Spain, till we got into one town. As soon as I got into the town, I felt unsafe. And I thought, this town looks dirty, and my friend and I didn't seem to be getting along as well. And it was unpleasant. And every night I started having nightmares, and I hadn't had nightmares since my early days of therapy. And I then, a few days into having nightmares and just feeling so unsettled, I rang one of my sisters because I'd gone amnesic as to what town our family originated from in Spain, and it was that town. So that's the town where, you know, we got personally persecuted. I did not consciously remember that when I went into that town. I wasn't thinking about that when I was on my holiday. And to me, that's a really powerful example of the impact that we do carry. We are affected by our ancestors, and when we can have more consciousness, then we can create change about that.
That's incredible.
Mm.
I'm curious to ask and to sort of shift the conversation a little bit towards
Sure.
Why do you feel awareness only creates more overwhelm and outrage?
The reason I I am always saying that is because awareness is empty when we don't have the mind-body tools to negotiate uncomfortable and overwhelming thoughts, feelings and realities. And so I think people become more resentful, outraged because they're aware and this is wrong, but they start to feel bitter and resentful and a hopelessness that our community is perceiving that it's broken and it's not going to be fixed in this generation. It creates a whole a blame and victim, right and wrong mentality. And I think the more we keep trying to do awareness, we've been trying to do awareness actually for decades now. And yes, it ramped up with Rosie Batty becoming so visible. But as we can see, we've got a lot more awareness, but we've still got the same statistics of women being murdered every week. And we've still got extraordinary amount of DV happening where the police are attending one every 2 minutes around Australia. So
it is actually really horrific though, isn't it? Like, and people are really shocked when they do hear that. I think the statistics are 1 woman a week dies in Australia from domestic violence. But like you said, if we just focus on the statistics or the outrage, and especially for women, because I think women are very deeply programmed to suppress anger, because it's not a good girl quality to have. Yes. And yet, we haven't been taught how to use that anger, how to see that anger is, and I was funny enough having this conversation with my daughter this morning, that anger is actually a really powerful and useful tool. And instead of suppressing it, if we can learn to tap into it and see, okay, well, I'm angry, where have my values been crossed, where have my boundaries been crossed? Yes. And then what do I need to do to change this? Taking into the actions, like what conversations do I need to have? What work do I need to do on myself? But it's so important, I think, that we don't demonize anger, and that we also don't just stay in it and stay, like you said, in the outrage that gets caused by all this awareness and the overwhelm.
Yes. Yeah, anger is sorry. Go on. Sorry.
Oh, no, but just saying, we need to know what to do with it. Like, what happens? Like, how do we deal with these emotions? How do we deal with these, or how do we process them so that we can, actively make the world a better place, actively make our lives, a better life, changing our experiences, choosing different options. And that's really hard, like you said, because everything's focused on the awareness, but then what?
Yes, and so I don't think we've got the mind-body tools to enable us to be with looking in our own life and making change, because when everybody says that, oh, yes, I would speak up or I would do something, in the reality, what I find when I speak further with people is that when they feel that someone could get upset at them and there could be a retaliation back at them, or there could be a rejection back at them, then they're not going to speak or take action. And so that's why I think we get caught in this bind where awareness is not helpful. And just to go on, I absolutely love and agree what you're doing with your daughter, and that's what I do too, because I tell people anger is an expression of self-love. It's about recognising our boundaries and something's impacting and affecting us. And anger is a feeling. There's nothing absolutely wrong with any feeling of anger or even rage. It's what we do with it. It's the behaviour that's either constructive or destructive. And and the anger keeps us activated. It allows us to be activated, but I agree, if we just keep staying in anger, it becomes toxic and we become resentful and we become right and wrong. And that's one of the reasons why I've moved on. Like, my book was one level of anger in a sense about what's not happening in our community. And so that provides information for people. But since then, I'm teaching, there's a whole continuum, depends where we are in our own journey as to what we need to develop so that we progress in our own journey about what we need to attend to in our own life or the life of those we love around us. So there's a a continuum, I believe, that there's a place for being angry and there's a place for moving beyond that and going beyond the current conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's so fascinating what you were saying as well. Like when there is that fear, if we speak up about domestic violence, that there's either that fear of retaliation or rejection. And I found it really funny because whenever I've posted about domestic violence, and I can have quite an active Facebook page, but the minute I make a post about domestic violence, nothing. And it's like there's a fear around engaging in the conversation. And I think as well, and we touched on this before we hit record, but about this feeling as well for women that we don't want to even identify that we've been victims of domestic violence, and for a whole myriad of reasons. And I know for myself, when I walked out of my marriage, I think it took me 5 years post-divorce before it hit me. And I was shocked. Like, how did that not click? How did I not know that was domestic violence? And it was such a really bizarre moment. And I remember feeling so, like, all the sadness and the anger and the grieving came pouring out. And just, I think as well, a lot of shame that I'd allowed myself to be in a relationship that, had been toxic. And I think that as well is probably another reason why so many of us don't want to engage in the conversation around domestic violence. And I've got friends who have dealt with domestic violence in their relationships and have, hidden their relationships from other people, or won't talk about their friends to it, or have lost their friends, or whose parents have cut them off. And so it really does create a whole lot of silence around the conversation of domestic violence, because we really do have these very valid fears of either being retaliated, of speaking up, and then having, the partner or someone else, or even our partner's family, crushing us down even further to silence us. Or we do have rejection of family and friends and support systems that have, in lots of people's lives they've cut themselves off from that person. So yeah, it's a really, I love this conversation because it brings up so many issues.
Hello, it's Ashley and Verity interrupting your listening pleasure. And we're here because we need your help.
We do.
We are planning what's happening in 2020 for Good Girls Don't podcast, and we absolutely need your help to do this. We very much value what you guys have to say about what you love about this podcast and what you want more of. So Verity, where do people need to go to help us out?
You need to head over to bit.ly/GGD pod survey and fill out this little survey that's going to help us understand you better, what you want from us, and how we can help you
break all the rules
and
then rewrite them in your own way. Awesome. Thank you very much for being a wonderful listener of this podcast. We love you, we value you, and keep sending us your feedback.
So yeah, it's a really, I love this conversation because it brings up so many issues that happen in real life around domestic violence.
Yes.
But why do you think it is that we do sort of not want to engage in the conversation so directly?
There's a number of reasons. We could talk for a few hours, I think.
5 words or less.
and definitely, like you said, the shame is a big one. Often I find women don't realise they're in domestic violence till they hear me give a talk or read something of mine. But often the thing is that there's shame because they perceive that they're creating the domestic violence as well. They perceive that what they're doing is abusive as well. And often it's not. When I ask them to describe what they're doing, they think they're doing the same thing as the person who's using abuse. And I teach them how to differentiate between it. But beyond that, I truly believe women don't, and I think it's the same for anybody who's, in an experience of domestic violence. No one wants to be defined by domestic violence. That's not all of who you are. It might have a huge impact on your life and on your identity and a whole range of things. But I think when people see something about domestic violence, they either think that's nothing to do with me, because they either don't want to open the door to what's going on in their own life, and because they don't have the mind-body tools to negotiate being with the uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Or that it's just so in their unconscious that they think, well, that happens to those other people that you hear about in the news. It doesn't happen to me or my family or friends, and they don't realise that it's actually in their own circle, or they may be very much living in it. But beyond that, I think most people, they don't want to focus on the problem. They don't want to focus on something that's not, they don't want to be defined by domestic violence, and they don't want to focus on the problem. And actually, in my journey over the last few years, I actually really agree with that now, that it's not about talking about domestic violence. If you look at the war on drugs, the war on terrorism, and everything that we've been doing, this war on no tolerance to domestic violence, it's not working. And the more we focus on the problem, the more we're putting fuel in the fire of that. I used to help teach people to understand what the definition of domestic violence is, so that they could become aware of if it's happening in their life or in someone else's life, because people often defined it by the types of abuse, but that's not the definition. And if you don't have the definition, you'll only recognise abuse by the types that you recognise and the behaviours in the types that you'll recognise. But I've even moved on from that, because if we look on a continuum, whether it's domestic violence or whether it's toxic, nobody wants to be in a relationship that gives them feelings of threat to their well-being on any level, even if it's not to the worst level. And so for me, it's about teaching people how to understand what happens in their own brain and body when they're under stress, and what they've learnt about relationships and love, and what's been missing and what they haven't known about why they get caught in relationships that aren't giving them good experiences. Because to me, if we focus on those skills, then we can be moving ahead now. We don't have to wait for even politicians to change laws or anything. We can start changing it when we understand how to be with our own mind-body system in the involuntary stress responses that happen, but also in what I've developed my own theory to do with why we get caught in abuse. And I think, it's really valid, if I can say so myself. And it's a life skill that I think most of us didn't learn from our parents.
Yes, absolutely.
And we can start doing that and moving on from domestic violence without continuing to talk about the problem.
I love it. It's such a really fascinating perspective, isn't it? And there's so much truth about it. Like, the more we focus on the problem, the more we just fuel the problem.
Yes.
And it's like, if you relate it into, say, like a business point of view, it's like if there's an issue in the business, you don't keep talking about the problem. You start talking about solutions.
Exactly.
I'm just wondering, before we quiz you more about your theories, you've mentioned a couple of times about, understanding the responses that we have in our body and our mind and how they all sort of come together. I'm wondering if you could just, for our listeners, possibly give us a little bit more information about what that might be. Maybe people can recognise that happening with themselves or people that they know.
I would love to. Thank you, Ashley. When we're in overwhelm, and if we think of trauma, it's any experience of overwhelm where in that moment we don't have the resources, the support or the safety to be with our natural instinctual response in the moment. So when we're in any place of overwhelm, our system automatically and involuntarily switches into the stress response. Now, back in the caveman days, that overwhelm would have been because there's a tiger there or something, threatening like that. But we're flooding into overwhelm for things all of the time in our modern lifestyle. And when that happens, it means that the corpus callosum, the nerve fibres between the left brain and the right brain, disconnects because our system's saying, I can't take in more input. I don't know what to do with what's happening right now. And when that disconnect happens, we experience a foggy head, we become forgetful, we mix things up, we might even become clumsy, we become hypervigilant, we might get cold hands and cold feet, we might find digestion really difficult, and we might find sleep really difficult. And all of those things is because the blood's moving to different parts of the brain and different parts of the body to mobilize us to go into that fight, flight, freeze, emergency stress response. So we actually can't process because the blood's moved away from the frontal cortex where we think about our feelings and feel about our thinking, and it's gone into that reptilian and amygdala brain of that survival response. And that to me is a primary reason why people get caught staying in domestic violence longer than they would like to. Not that anyone would like to be in it, but before they can realise it, because they're so busy in that survival, putting out the spot fires, just trying to get through the moment, that they can't actually make all of the connections about what they're living with. So it's so important to understand that's involuntary, that shutdown in our system where we don't have that processing capacity that we would have if we weren't under that stress.
Wow,
makes
so
much
fascinating, isn't it? It really is. Do you feel as well, I'm just asking this question because it's come up a few times in a lot of different conversations, that there's because when we're in that stress response, like our adrenaline starts pumping and different hormones being released. Is there any sort of, I guess, research or discussion around, I guess, becoming addicted to that feeling of being stressed? Like, can we literally be addicted to being in toxic relationships? Not because it feels great, but because we become addicted to those, hormone releases and chemical releases in our brain that kind of keep us on edge and keep us alert. And, I guess that cyclic drama of things like, becoming into alert and being hypervigilant, and then obviously going into that safety, because a lot of, relationships with domestic violence, it's not always continuous violence day after day after day after day. But it's that, there's a conversations as well about how women are then waiting for that, I guess, letdown where they feel safe again, and that, the nurturing comes in and the apologising comes in and the promises come in, and there's that kind of cyclic behaviour that can go on.
Yeah. I want to say 4 quick things. I'll try and summarise them as succinctly as I can. The other stress response, other than the fight, flight, freeze response, is that we have, as females, a response that's activated by our estrogen and oxytocin levels through stress. It's called the tending instinct. So we tend, mend and befriend. It's about, for survival, the tribe needs to survive, even though in modern day we don't need the tribe to survive. So we can tend to keep looking after, which can then look as if there's a trauma bond, but it's part of the stress response because that's how we've been geared to make sure that we survive as a tribe. The other thing is that trauma bond. What happens, like if I give example, in my childhood, both my parents were threatening to me on a number of different levels. And so in my brain, the way I understand it is it got mapped as what was unsafe. I had to act as if it was safe because I was a dependent child. What was unlovable and I had revulsion about, I had to act as if it was lovable. And so that's what I think people often talk about with trauma bonding. And so when you meet somebody else, the chemicals light up and you label it as love because that's what you had to label it as a child, because we didn't have that clarity from and modelling from our parents about how to be with someone's worst face and what's toxic. So
wow.
So there's the tending instinct, there's the trauma bond. The other thing that can keep us looking as if we're addicted when we're not is that one coping mechanism that people have is if there's something, it's called the counterphobic response, that when something is scary for us, instead of running the other way, some people will go, well, I'm going to go in the lion's mouth and count the teeth. And
I've heard of this.
Yeah, and one of the things with doing, actually, I can actually combine the fourth one into this one with the counterphobic response. We can do this in a range of different ways, and part of it is, I think, because it's a terror of, if there's the boogeyman around, we want to be able to see where the boogeyman is, yeah?
Yeah.
And so if we get in closer, then we know where it is. I realised after I escaped that, you know, when I was living with him, I could keep more track of things than I didn't know where he was, where he might, you know, suddenly appear from when I wasn't living with him. And so that counterphobic response and that desire of wanting to make sure that you know where the bad is and wanting to stay in some kind of control can mean that we stay in closer contact than our system would really want. So I think there are 4 reasons why it appears as if we're addicted, but we're not.
That's so fascinating, and it really does explain, I guess, that feeling of wanting to be in control of something that is uncontrollable, because you can't control another person. But if you can stay closer to them, if you can observe them, if you can keep track of them, there's elements that you can, you know, it's like getting the early warning signals early enough so that you can almost foresee how to protect yourself, or you know, choices that you can make before, you know, the storm hits. If you can get close enough to see those, you know, precursors and things. Makes total sense. This is an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Yes, it is.
I'm glad it's helpful. Really glad.
And it is debunking so many myths around domestic violence that we have.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much.
Verity's mind is officially blown. Anita, I'm really quite curious to ask, you've said before that gender equality isn't the problem and it's also not the solution. What do you think is going on with that?
Yeah, I started getting pissed off, to be honest, about people saying it's gender inequality and, you know, that's the solution and everything. And gender equality is absolutely important and desirable for a healthy society. But the reason why I didn't think that was the solution is because in my practice of nearly 25 years, I've worked with women who've been abused by men. I've also worked with men who've been awfully abused by women.
Yeah.
And I've also worked with same-sex couples where, you know, irrespective of whether they're both male or both female, there's abuse happening. So for me, it didn't answer it. And for me, if there's an answer, it's absolute, you know, that this is the issue. And so I thought it's not gender inequality. It's what I call, and your mind's going to be blown even more now, I think, Verity. I created the term, the feminine principle hemispherectomy.
And what?
Yeah. Hemispherectomy is an actual term where they used to disconnect the 2 hemispheres in the old days when there was certain problems going on in someone's brain. But I feel like as a society, what we are living with is the hemispherectomy of the feminine principle, which is the right brain.
Yes.
I briefly touched on before. And I think as a society, when it's just the left brain, just those mathematical, practical, scientific, logical, sequential, detail, and what's conscious and what's known, it becomes toxic when that's all that's valued. And when we don't value the feminine principles, that it's as if no one would say, let's just get rid of the right brain, but that's what we're doing in our society. We're devaluing everything that's in the feminine principle, in the right brain, the feelings, the body, the unconscious, the mysterious, the unknown, the right brain also holds the big picture of everything and going beyond things. And so for me, the answer is, when we have a society where every man and every woman values and honours their masculine and feminine principles within themselves, then we're going to have a much healthier society. I remember when I was in uni, in sociology, they talked about that the differences between men and women are no bigger than the differences between a man and a man or a woman and a woman. So what we need changed for gender inequality is for people to value certain things, and that comes about when we've got more access to our feelings and our right brain. And when we think about the right brain and feelings, that is what creates change. That's what mobilizes behavior. Our feelings mobilize behavior. It's not our conscious, logical left brain that says, I shouldn't have sugar or I should go to bed earlier. It's the feeling of we either feel scared for our health or we feel something else that mobilizes us to take the actions. Feelings in trauma work changes neural pathways, and it's not our conscious brain that will make changes in workplaces or relationships or politics or the legal system. It's when we can have access to our feelings and be able to be informed by our feelings, then
Yes.
and that's all the feminine principle. But we don't value, it's told you're too sensitive, you're too emotional,
Just too much of everything.
Yeah.
And I think this is the beautiful conversations that Ashley and I have about feminism. I think what you've just said is Ashley's and I most sort of honest definition of feminism. It's not about men and women. It's about all human beings embracing what you've just referred to, these feminine principles within themselves.
Yeah.
It's about men allowing themselves to feel,
Yes.
and to acknowledge those feelings and label those feelings, and to be able to sit with those feelings in the unknowing and the mystery of those feelings, in the uncertainty of those feelings, in the ickiness of those feelings, and being able to process them, and then being mobilized into, resourceful behavior, resourceful actions, things that, are more productive. And men are often taught to not do that. And we've had this conversation with a few men on the podcast as well. And they've all pretty much said the same things, from men, saying that we need to teach men to become more in touch with their feelings. They've been told not to have them, to squash them, that their physical body, their rational brain is more important, their thoughts are more important than their feelings. But as well for women, we're allowed to have our feelings, we're really not encouraged to voice them.
Yes.
And, that again is one of the underlying ideals behind Good Girls Don't podcast, is that we're allowing women and men to come on the podcast and to feel, to express, and to have the voice for the things they really, really feel very strongly and emotively about, that needs to create change. So I love what you're talking about. I think this is such a brilliant, brilliant way. And it's something I never would have thought of how to look at something like domestic violence. It's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. The thing, I think we've kind of been very reductionistic in the more we think the society's evolving, is that like men can have thoughts and women can have feelings, but then we're stuck because it's like we need to be able to have thoughts and feelings.
Oh my goodness, my partner would just shoot that down so quickly. Like, no, Ashley has too many thoughts. Anita, how can our listeners take action in their own lives, either to support others who are experiencing DV or to reduce DV on a grander scale within our society?
Well, I really encourage everyone to, if you think about the word responsible, it's about having the ability to respond. And so think about in your own life, can you speak about the uncomfortable? Can you self-soothe yourself? Can you notice things that might be out of your conscious awareness? Are you receptive to getting signals either from your body, your feelings, other noticings, people, feedback when you visual cues of things? Like, start to build your skills so that you're more attuned and you can take care of yourself. Because if we all become more responsible for ourselves, then everything's taken care of.
Yeah.
If we have those mind-body tools to look after ourselves. And if you don't know how to do that, the problem is, I think, as an adult, is that we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable, or we don't want to even spend the time or the money giving ourselves the tools that are going to help us for the rest of our lives. It doesn't make sense to me. But we just don't value enough our personal development. Our parents couldn't teach us everything. They had their own limitations and their gaps. And it's our responsibility as an adult to, do I know how to listen to my unconscious, my body, my feelings, and take action? And if I think I could do it better, or if I'd like to be able to do it better, then find someone that teaches, that you feel aligned with, that teaches you those tools, because it doesn't have to take long to learn tools, and you'll be resourced for life. That's my general recommendation. It depends.
I love it.
Everyone is in their circumstances, as to, I could give you tons of other advice around.
You know what? I just heard that saying as, everybody, please go get a therapist right now.
Go be responsible and get a therapist.
Well, we've said this before on the podcast. It may not be your fault what's happened to you in your life, but your responsibility is healing.
Yes.
Yeah. Your healing is your responsibility. It's so true. So, Anita, you have some webinars that are coming up in December. You've got the Love Secrets, Owning Our Defenses So They Don't Own Us, and the Best Self-Soothing Tool to Move from Any Stuck Place That Won't Trigger Trauma.
Yes.
Oh, that's a biggie.
Yeah. And that one's the first one coming up, because I really wanted to do that soon so that people have a resource moving into Christmas and the new year, which can be a very stressful time for people, because I just keep hearing of people really suffering. And so even though it might sound like I'm saying everyone should go to go to therapy to address any traumas, therapy is not necessarily what everybody wants to do, but everybody needs to learn tools. And so I'm creating a whole lot of different ways for people to easily access tools so that they can move on. And so these webinars are so that they can learn about their own involuntary defense system and get the map and know how to work with it. And the Love Secrets one is my theory about, which everyone can take on board, about how to negotiate relationships in a better way. They're my three favourite webinars to do, but I'm always open to, other webinars that people would like me to do, and I can continue building them, because I've just got so much content going on from all my experiences that I just want to share it with everybody.
How can people find these webinars? What's the best way for them to
so they can, on my Facebook page, The Wolf in a Suit, they can find the links to the next webinar, and once that's done, the next webinar will go up there as a pinned post. Or they can contact me directly, email me, and I can send them out some information.
And we'll have all of those links where you can actually contact Anita in the show notes.
And Anita, you also have some freebies as well for our listeners.
I do. On my website, on the homepage, there's a relationship status checklist if people want to download that. And if you look on the tab that says for services and click on the one for interventions, at the bottom of that page, there's another download that's free. That one's very, very comprehensive. It's big. It's my 34 myths about domestic violence. And I go in deeper than you've probably ever read or listened to about really expanding on my understandings that involve the unconscious and all of those things. But for each myth, I give a short answer. So if you don't want to know more, you can just read the short answer. But if you want more depth, then just keep reading.
Oh, I love it. It's choose your own adventure.
I know, all the hairs on my arms have just stood up. I'm like, yeah, we'll be downloading that after.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us about such a big public issue. It's deeply appreciated.
Oh, my absolute pleasure and honour, Ashley and Verity. I love connecting with both of you and your passion and your integrity, and I just am so passionate about getting this information out to reach as many people who need to hear it and can benefit from it. So thank you for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, Anita. It's honestly just our absolute pleasure.
hey, if you want to continue this conversation, head over to our Facebook page and be part of the revolution. You can find us at Good Girls Don't Podcast on Facebook. Please note we cannot create change alone. Your support, likes, comments, shares, and iTunes reviews will help us to give a voice to the insanely inspirational women and the controversial issues that we discuss.
If you'd like to be a part of our podcast, or if you have an issue that you have a burning desire for us to bring into the light, please contact us. With fierceness, Ashley
and Verity.
Get ready for the revolution.